The story of Job is one of the most fascinating in the Bible, full of lessons that touch our hearts and make us think about life. Imagine someone who was known for being a good, just person and who had enormous respect for God. That was Job. He lived in a place called Uz, which today no one knows exactly where it was, but that doesn't matter so much. What really matters is what his life can teach us. Job was a man who did everything right, someone who always sought to act honestly and correctly. He is remembered to this day because his story is full of challenges and mysteries that help us understand difficult topics, such as why good people suffer, what it means to be truly just, how to trust God even when everything goes wrong, and how to accept that He has a greater plan, even if we don't understand it at the time. This story is not just about suffering. It is about strength, faith, and how, even in the most difficult moments, God is in control. Job is like a wise friend who, even though he lives in such distant times, has a lot to teach us about facing the ups and downs of life. But before that, check if you've already subscribed, like and share the video. Let's dive into this journey and discover how Job's life can inspire and transform our way of seeing the world and our relationship with God. Job and his family. Job was a very rich and blessed man. He had a large family, with 20 children in all. At the beginning of his story, he had 10 children, but during a very difficult phase in his life, he lost all of them. It was a huge tragedy, but God later blessed him again, giving him another 10 children. The Bible doesn't tell us the name of Job's wife, but we know that she was by his side during these times of ups and downs. Job's family was very special. His children got along really well and loved spending time together. They organized big parties, where everyone got together to celebrate, eat, and have fun. It was as if it was always a birthday or Christmas party atmosphere. Job, on the other hand, was a very devoted and loving father. He cared deeply about his children and wanted to ensure that they were always at peace with God. That is why, after each banquet or gathering, Job did something very special. He prayed for each of them and offered sacrifices to God. He thought, what if one of them has done something wrong unintentionally? I want to make sure that God forgives them. Job's care shows that he was a father who not only loved his children, but also cared about their spiritual lives. He was an example of faith and responsibility within the family, someone who showed, through actions, what it meant to trust and respect God. Job's time. We do not know exactly when Job lived, but everything indicates that it was a long time ago, in a period known as the patriarchal era. This means that he probably lived at the same time as Abraham or even before that. Back then, things were very different from what we know today. There were no big cities, cars, or technology. People lived in simple places, usually in tents, and lived off the land, caring for animals and growing food. Job was like the leader of his family, a very important role at that time. He was not only the head of the household, he also took care of the spiritual side of the family. He said prayers, offered sacrifices to God, and helped his family follow the right path. It was as if he were the priest of the home, ensuring that everyone was at peace with God. And do you know what was considered wealth in Job's time? It wasn't gold coins, jewelry, or money, as we think of today. Someone's wealth was measured by the number of animals they owned. Job was incredibly rich because he had many camels, oxen, sheep, and other animals. Having so many livestock meant that he could feed his family, trade with other people, and even help those in need. It was like owning several successful businesses today. Thinking about Job's time helps us understand how he lived, what was important to him, and how he trusted God in the midst of a life that, although so different from ours, also had challenges and valuable lessons. Job's trial. Imagine someone who had everything: family, wealth, health, and was respected by everyone. That was Job. But suddenly, he went through such a difficult time that it almost seems like a movie story. It all started with a conversation between God and Satan. Satan said something like, Job is only faithful to God because he has everything good. If he loses everything, he will stop believing. So God allowed Satan to test Job on one condition: he could not take his life. And that's when things started to go wrong for Job. In the blink of an eye, he lost everything. His animals, which were his wealth, were stolen or destroyed. His servants were killed. And worst of all, his children, whom he loved so much, died in a terrible accident. It was unimaginable pain, all at once. Even so, Job showed incredible strength. He said something that is remembered to this day: "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In other words, he recognized that everything he had came from God, and that, even in the midst of tragedy, God still deserved to be praised. But Satan didn't give up. He thought, if Job loses his health, then he'll complain about God. So he made Job seriously ill, with horrible sores all over his body. It was so bad that Job would sit on the floor, pick up broken pieces of pottery, and use them to scratch his sores. Imagine how much that must have hurt, inside and out. To make matters worse, Job's wife, who was also suffering from all of this, said to him, "Why do you still believe in God? Curse God and die." But Job, even though he was full of pain, replied that he would not do that. He knew that God was in control, even if he did not understand the reason for all of this suffering. This part of the story shows how strong Job was in faith and in his heart. He faced losses, pain, and even harsh words from those who were by his side, but he remained firm, believing that God had a greater purpose for all of this. It is a lesson in perseverance and trust that inspires us to this day. Job's friend's Job was at the worst moment of his life, sitting on the ground, covered in wounds and full of pain. It was then that three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, decided to visit him. At first, it seemed like they would be a great support. They arrived, remained silent for 7 days and 7 nights, just sitting next to Job, respecting his pain. It was as if they were saying, "We're here for you no matter what." But then things changed. When they started talking, instead of comforting Job, they did exactly the opposite. The friends believed that if something so bad had happened to him, it was because Job must have done something wrong. In their minds, it was simple. If you do good, good things happen. If bad things happen, it's because you did something wrong. So they started accusing Job, saying things like, "Just confess. You must have a hidden sin. God is punishing you, and you need to repent." Can you imagine how Job felt? He was already suffering so much, and hearing this from people who were supposed to help him only made it even harder. Job tried to defend himself, saying that he had done nothing wrong to deserve such suffering, but the friends kept insisting. In addition to these three friends, a young man named Elihu appeared in the conversation. He had a slightly different idea. Elihu said that suffering can be used by God as a way to teach or correct us. He didn't accuse Job in the same way as the others, but he also thought Job needed to stop complaining and trust that God had a reason for everything. This part of the story shows how, sometimes, even people who want to help can end up saying things that hurt even more. Job teaches us that suffering is not always the fault of something we did, and that, instead of judging, we should be there for those in need with compassion and true love. The encounter with God. Imagine the scene. Job, sitting on the ground, hurt, sad, and full of questions that seemed to have no answers. He had lost everything: his family, his health, his wealth, and now he just wanted to understand why God had allowed so much suffering. He wanted a reason, a clear explanation. He wanted to talk to God directly and know what was happening. And suddenly, something spectacular happened. God appeared to Job. But he didn't arrive discreetly or silently. He came in the middle of a whirlwind. Think of a great tornado, strong and powerful, with a sound so intense that it seemed like the wind itself was talking. This entry already showed that God had something very important to say. Job, who was already impressed, became even more attentive. After all, who wouldn't be when seeing something like that? But the surprise didn't stop there. God didn't start by answering Job's questions in the way he expected. He didn't explain the why of Job's suffering or reveal all the details of what was going on behind the scenes. Instead, God turned the tables and began asking questions that left Job speechless. Where were you when I created the earth? Who drew the boundaries of the sea and said, "This far you may go and no further"? Do you know how the stars are placed in the sky, or how I feed the lions and ravens? Can you make the rain fall, or do you know how the seasons cycle? These questions were like an invitation for Job to see something bigger. God was showing Job that the world is much more complex, beautiful, and purposeful than any human being can comprehend. It was as if God was saying, "Job, you may not understand everything right now, but trust me. I am the creator of everything, and I am in control, even when things seem out of whack." As Job listened, he began to understand something profound. It was not necessary to know all the answers or understand all the reasons. The most important thing was to trust in the God who created everything and who knows even the smallest details of creation. After hearing all this, Job was so moved that he said, "I have always heard of you, but now my eyes see you." This is a very special phrase. Job was saying that before, he had only known God from a distance, as if he had only heard stories about him. But now, after this experience, Job felt that he truly knew God up close, in a personal and intimate way. This encounter transformed Job. He realized that God is greater than any problem, doubt, or suffering. He understood that even when life seems difficult and confusing, God has a perfect plan that goes beyond our understanding. And more than that, God was with him the whole time, even in silence and pain. This moment teaches us a great lesson. God is in control, even when we cannot see the reason behind the difficulties. It is a call to trust him with all our heart, knowing that his love and wisdom never fail. In the end, what matters is not having all the answers, but being certain that God is by our side, guiding us on paths that only he can understand. Job's restoration. After going through one of the most difficult times anyone could imagine, Job's life took a completely unexpected turn. He had lost everything: his possessions, his health, and, most painfully, his children. But God was not only aware of everything Job had faced, he had a special plan for restoration. First, God dealt with Job's friends. Those friends who, instead of comforting him, spent all their time accusing him and saying wrong things about God, were rebuked. God made it clear that they were wrong, that they did not understand what he was doing, and that they had spoken unfairly. But instead of punishing them, God gave Job an important mission: to pray for them. This showed Job's generous and compassionate heart, which chose to forgive and intercede for those who had hurt him, even after everything he had already faced. And it was from that moment that things began to change. God began to restore Job's life in a way that no one could have imagined. He not only gave back what Job had lost, but he blessed Job with double of everything. If Job was already a rich and prosperous man before, now he had even more: larger flocks, more servants, more resources. It was as if God was saying, "Job, you have remained faithful to me even in the worst circumstances. Now, see how I can bless you abundantly." But the blessings didn't stop there. God brought joy back to Job's home by giving him 10 more children. And among these children were 3 very special daughters: Jemima, Keziah, and Karen Happuch. Scripture makes a point of emphasizing that these daughters were not just part of a blessed family. They were known as the most beautiful women in the entire region. And this was something very significant, because in those days, the value of women was not always recognized, but God made sure to honor them in a special way. On top of all this, Job received a gift that many of us would only dream of having: a long life full of peace and joy. He lived another 140 years after his ordeal. That was enough time to see his children grow up and meet his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. Imagine Job, sitting with his family, surrounded by generations of descendants, telling stories about all that God has done in his life and how he has completely restored him. Job's story does not end with sadness, but with hope and victory. It teaches us that even in the most difficult times, God never forgets those who remain faithful to Him. Job proved that no matter how great the suffering, God is able to transform pain into joy, losses into blessings, and challenges into powerful testimonies of love, care, and restoration. So, when you face difficulties, remember Job. He shows us that faithfulness to God is worth it and that, in the right time, God can turn any situation around, bringing something much greater and more beautiful than we can imagine. Conclusion: the life of Job and what it teaches us. The story of Job is much more than just a story about suffering. It is a true lesson in faith, patience, and trust in God. Imagine losing everything you love most and still believing that God is in control. Job faced challenges that seemed impossible to bear. He lost his possessions, his family, and his health. To make matters worse, the friends who should have been there for him began to blame him for everything he was going through. His own wife, in a moment of despair, suggested that he give up trusting in God. But Job, even in the midst of all this pain, never abandoned his faith. He questioned, yes, because he was human, but he never lost his confidence that God knew what he was doing. This perseverance is so impressive that, in the New Testament, James speaks of Job as a model of patience. James reminds us that Job not only endured adversity, but also trusted that God had a greater purpose, even if he could not understand it at the time. And in the end, Job saw how God turned his pain into something great. What can we learn from this? First, that trusting in God does not mean that we will never face difficulties. Job was a just, faithful, and God-fearing man, but that didn't exempt him from going through difficult times. The difference is that, even when everything seemed lost, Job continued to believe that God was in control. Second, Job's story teaches us that God does not abandon us, even in the darkest moments. We may not understand the reason for suffering while it is happening, but that does not mean that God does not have a purpose. Job was only able to understand what was happening after everything was over and he had a direct encounter with God. This reminds us that sometimes our vision is limited, but God sees everything, from beginning to end. Another incredible point is how God restored Job's life. After all the suffering, God not only gave back what Job had lost, but gave him much more than he had before. Job received double his wealth, had more children, and lived a long and full life, even seeing his great-great-grandchildren. This shows that God not only sustains us in difficult times, but also has the power to transform our pain into unimaginable blessings. And what's more, Job's story is also about love and forgiveness. Even after being accused by his friends, Job prayed for them when God asked him to. He could have held a grudge, but he chose to obey God, showing that his faith was greater than any resentment. That's why Job is not only an example of patience, but also of humility, faith, and absolute trust in God. He teaches us that even in the strongest storms, we can trust that God has a perfect plan. When we face difficulties, doubts, or times when it seems like everything is falling apart, Job's story reminds us that we are not alone. We can trust that God is working on something much bigger, even if we can't see it right now. And in His own time, God will bring peace, restoration, and purpose. Job's life proves that in the end, God always has something extraordinary in store for those who remain faithful to Him. So when times are tough, remember Job. He inspires us to have faith, even in the face of hardship, and to believe that God turns our pain into joy and our tears into blessings.